Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness, brilliant.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Tomorrow, politics returns in Westminster, but I've got to say, over the last few weeks, it feels like it's been going apace around the country. Today, we explore what's up with the government. We look across to Ukraine, to energy and to the polls. All that after the headlines.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. Now, there has been a significant escalation of Russian shelling across Ukraine this morning. Casualties are being reported across the country following explosions in several cities, including the capital. Kyiv's mayor says missiles have hit critical infrastructure, and the President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of trying to wipe his country off the face of the earth. The attacks are the most intense to hit the capital since the start of the war. Blasts were also reported in Lviv and Ternopil in the west, as well as Dnipro in central Ukraine. The Ukrainian Defence Ministry has vowed revenge. Well, the Russia strikes come after President Vladimir Putin accused Ukraine of a targeted attack at the weekend, a truck explosion damaging a bridge that links Russia to Crimea. He's described the incident as an act of terror. In other news now, the Prime Minister is going to urge MPs to work together as a united party as Parliament resumes. Liz Truss has appointed Greg Hands as International Trade Minister. He replaces Conor Burns, who was sacked from his role on Friday following a misconduct complaint. Hands supported Rishi Sunak during the leadership contest. The appointment's being seen as an attempt to ease party tension after criticism that Ms Truss had surrounded herself with allies. Scotland's First Minister is expected to tell SNP delegates that independence will lead to a better relationship between the UK's four nations. Nicola Sturgeon, who's due to close the party conference in Aberdeen this afternoon, will also accuse the UK government of denying Scottish democracy. The SNP leader will say that independence would create a partnership of equals in the UK. The Supreme Court will rule if a prospective bill to hold another vote is within the powers of Holyrood later this week. Criminal barristers in England and Wales have voted to end strike action after accepting a pay offer from the government. The offer from the Ministry of Justice includes reforms to set fees for legal aid work and an investment of £54 million in the criminal bar. Almost 57% of the bar voted to accept the deal. Strike action will end at 6 tonight. ScotRail's warning passengers of widespread travel disruption across its network today as railway strikes continue. It's members of the RMT who are staging a 24-hour walkout over their ongoing pay dispute. There will only be a limited number of ScotRail services that will operate, and passengers are urged only to travel if they really need to. We're on your TV, online and your DAB Plus radio. It's GB News. Now let's head back to Tom for the briefing.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, firstly today, there have been significant developments in Ukraine overnight. At least 13 people were killed and many more injured by Russian missile strikes on the city of Zaporizhia. And now Kiev, Lviv and other Ukrainian cities have been hit by blasts too. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, now in its 8th month, has intensified. Vladimir Putin has accused Ukraine of attacking the Kerch Bridge to Russian-annexed Crimea, saying it was, quote, an act of terrorism. And in response to this, he appears to have been hitting out now at civilian targets in the rest of Ukraine. Well, let's discuss it all and these latest developments now with Bob Seeley, the Conservative MP and former foreign correspondent in the USSR, who holds a PhD in Russian military strategy as well. Bob, who better to talk to about these very latest developments? Are you surprised that we seem to be seeing more civilian targets being hit now in Ukraine?
No, not necessarily. Good morning, Tom. Good morning to your viewers and listeners. Some kind of revenge attack was inevitable. I'm actually quite surprised of the general feebleness of them, because the Kerch Bridge was a serious and highly strategic attack. And what the Russians seem to be doing is finding targets in various cities. And there's no indication, I certainly haven't seen an indication that those targets are strategic in any sense, or indeed are going to change the course of the war. And fundamentally, that's the problem here, that there's very little that Putin can do to change the course of the war, apart from winning on the battlefield. And he seems to be incapable. He, his army, his generals seem to be incapable of doing that.
Really, really important for people in this country, indeed in Europe, and perhaps the rest of the world too. We're seeing extremely high energy bills, of course. The government has committed to keeping those energy bills down for 2 years. Now, if this war ends in the next 6 months or goes on for another 2 years, will be very, very material for how many billions, tens of billions, this government has to borrow to keep those energy bills down. In your assessment, could this war be done within the next 6 months? We're 8 months in, the Ukrainians are making advances, but it gets a lot harder in that cold Eastern European winter.
I mean, Tom, two very good questions. Firstly, about energy bills, and secondly, about the length of the war. The length of the war could carry on for another year, 18 months. Although the Russians, very difficult to see how the Russians can win. The last phase of the war ended in September when the Ukrainians overran positions in Kharkiv and have started to overrun positions in Kherson in the south. So in the east in Kharkiv, in the south in Kherson. So this stage of the war, the Ukrainians can now sense victory, but there is a long way to go. So I think even the Ukrainians think this war is going to last until at least the end of next year, and then maybe into 2024 as well. The potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, I thought might come by the spring. I was with Ukrainian MPs at conference in Birmingham last week, and they were saying, actually, no, these decisions could be made by January, potentially, depending on how badly Putin's war is going. So there is permanent pressure now on those Russian positions, and I don't think that's going to ease. And just bringing more people into an army which has effectively become a rabble, you just create a bigger rabble. So the Russians need to do incredibly detailed, difficult structural work to try to make their armies and their logistical supply function better. When it comes to prices, interestingly, Tom, you're starting to read now the idea that actually there's becoming an equilibrium in liquid gas markets and energy markets. So it's not impossible, to put an optimistic view on this, that the expense of decoupling has now happened, or a significant element of it has happened, and you may see energy wholesale market prices for energy and for liquid natural gas start to decline from next year onwards. So it might be that inflationary hit, the energy price hit, is, I hope, less than we think, and that may start to come down by next spring, potentially. But let's see what's happening. Let's see what happens.
That's a really, really significant point to raise because, of course, many people have been talking about the idea that the West should seek some sort of negotiated solution in Ukraine, that this might be somehow better for energy costs in the West. Judging by that assessment, and indeed by the incentives that that sort of negotiated settlement would proffer to Putin and his regime, it doesn't sound like the best idea.
Well, negotiating the end of this war is up to the Ukrainians, not up to us. And although we may have our red lines and we can always stop supplying that weaponry to Ukraine, fundamentally, they are fighting for their territory, and we recognise their right to defend their territory, to buy arms, and to put armies in the field to defend their country against, let's face it, the first major illegal invasion of a country since World War II. So it's up to the Ukrainians to decide. Would I be nervous about the Ukrainians reinvading Crimea? I would actually, yes, because I think you're much more likely to get a potential nuclear response from the Russians. So we need to be within the bounds of what we think is going to achieve a Ukrainian victory without catastrophically widening this war. And there is a fine balance. And just to say Putin is bluffing is not good enough. We need to understand that we don't know if Putin is bluffing when he's using tactical nuclear weapons or when he's threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons. But what we need to do is assume he's not bluffing so we can work our way back from that to work out the best way to ensure that Ukraine wins, but Ukraine wins without sparking a wider conflict. And that is a very nuanced point.
Really, really profound worries there with regard to nuclear weapons. We're going to let you go, but in a sentence, if you would, Bob Seeley, in your role as an MP, as a Conservative MP, you've just got back from conference. We're expecting Liz Truss to be meeting with a lot of you and your colleagues over the next week or so. How safe is she?
Oh, she's very safe. Look, we're not going to change the leader again. Just sorry, all these people, all these noises off in the politest, nicest possible way. Any of my colleagues that want to kick off, my just very respectful advice is put a sock in it. We've got to make this work,
Seeley,
and we will.
Thank you so much for joining us. Candid as ever on the briefing this morning. Really appreciate your time. Live from a very beautiful Isle of Wight this morning. Well, let's cross now to Westminster to speak to Victoria Prentice, the Minister of State at the Department for Work and Pensions. Thank you for joining us this morning. The government is going to return to Westminster, I suppose, tomorrow for what will be yet another torrid week. Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, a meeting of the 1922 committee, which the Prime Minister is expected to address this week as well. It's very, very choppy waters for only a couple of weeks in to this new government. What's gone wrong?
Well, Tom, I think it's fair to say that we have had a bumpy few weeks, but I don't see any need for that to continue. We're at the beginning of a new term now. We've all, as you said, we're coming back to Westminster today. I'm in the department already. And I think this is now a time for getting on with some really serious detailed policy work and getting some legislation through Parliament. We know that people are worried about their finances this winter. You've been talking quite rightly about the dreadful global situation, and people are worried about the war. And what's important to us really is that we provide that careful, sensible, calm government which the public need and deserve. I don't think people are interested in the interior workings of the Conservative Party.
It's a compelling point you raise, that this is really a government that will win, that will survive and thrive, or indeed fail on regard to policy and delivery. And yet that doesn't seem to be cutting through so much. I'm just looking at what's happened over the last few weeks. I mean, this morning, barristers have called off their strike. That's a significant win for the government. Just over a week ago, the ONS...
I'm really pleased to hear that news. As a barrister myself, I think that's a really positive step forward and a good win, if I may say so, for our ministers in that department who've worked hard with the leaders of the bar to come to the right resolution there.
But it's not just that that's gone successfully, of course. The ONS, just over a week ago, uprated growth forecasts, saying that the UK, in fact, is not in recession. Unlike the US, we're seeing economic growth. We've got lower borrowing costs, lower borrowing, I should say, as a total than France, than the US, than Japan, than Canada, than Italy. And there are some reports now suggesting that the Northern Ireland Protocol issue, that intractable mess, might well be close to a solution. Given that there is so much right going on in policy terms, that there is actually stuff that's being delivered, why on earth is that not cutting through to the polls? Is simply the communication in this government not up to scratch?
Well, with respect, Tom, I think it's not as attractive necessarily for the media to talk about. So what I've come on to talk about today is another good news story. It's World Mental Health Day. We're very proud to be rolling out in the department, England-wide, nationwide, many, many more employment assistance, people who help you into work if you suffer from a really common mental health condition. So this is something we've been working on for a long time in government. We've piloted it and we've tested it really hard. We've crunched all the numbers. We know that it works. So if you're suffering from a mental health condition, say anxiety or depression or perhaps an eating disorder, you might well be receiving talking therapies. These employment coaches work alongside that talking therapy. You get maybe 10 sessions per person to help you either stay in work or help you into work and sort of support you and give you confidence as you grow the amount of work that you can do. So that's a good news story. Very little pickup. All anybody's really wanted me to talk about on the media round this morning has been internal squabbling in the Tory party. And I have to say that's just not my perception. My perception as a government minister is that we are cracking on with the job. And I think that message will percolate eventually.
And just finally, I should ask you on something else your department presides over, and of course that is universal credit. There seems to have not been a decision made yet by the government as to whether it should rise in line with inflation or in line with average earnings. Is there a concern that if it rises in line with inflation rather than earnings, there's an unfairness there, that people who are not receiving universal credit will get less of an increase than those on benefits? Is that being factored into the calculation?
Well, Tom, what I'm not going to do is make the policy on air. Again, it's really important that we do this in the proper way and we follow the process. So what we've got to do is wait for the earnings figures to come out tomorrow and then wait for the inflation figures, which come out on the 19th next week. And then the Secretary of State, my Secretary of State in this department, has a legislative duty to consider both of those things and everything else that people want to throw into the mix. But the figures are what matters. We then go through, crunch the numbers, do some careful, considered policy making, as this government does do, and then we will communicate, because obviously I do understand that people on benefits are very worried about how much their benefits will be uprated. So we need to communicate that decision as soon as we possibly can. But it is important that we go through the right process to come to the right decision.
Well, Victoria Prentice, DWP Minister, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Really appreciate your time. Moving on now, the world of energy can sometimes seem so depressing. It can seem expensive. It can seem scarce. It can seem like there are no immediate solutions. But one of the most exciting announcements from the Conservative Party conference last week came from Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg in this area, who announced the construction of the UK's and potentially the world's first prototype commercial nuclear fusion reactor. Fusion, now that's the process of energy creation that goes on inside the sun, creates energy by, instead of splitting atoms apart, forcing them together. It's incredibly difficult to harness, but let's cross now to an expert to try and explain just how it might well be achieved. James Marrow, Professor of Nuclear Materials Science at the University of Oxford, joins me now. Thank you so much for your time this morning. First of all, can I ask about the process of discovery here. We have been able to create fusion reactions that have lasted for very small amounts of time, but have needed huge amounts of energies to sort of contain. Why does it always seem that nuclear fusion energy is decades away?
Sorry, there's a police car going past.
Why does it seem that nuclear fusion is so far away?
Sorry, I couldn't catch the question. There's a police car went past.
Ah, right, I will try one more time. Nuclear fusion energy, why does it seem like it's so far away from us that, that we were sort of promised this in 20 years ago?
Because it's remarkably difficult to control. I mean, the process of fusion is difficult to achieve and difficult to control. That's pretty much done. But the other side is containing for long enough and making a sustainable plant which will last for decades rather than hours. It's the materials and the engineering is really the hardest thing with fusion. The physics is done.
With the physics being done, does this mean that it is not really in the role of science fiction, that this could be something that comes on stream in the UK, that this could be a big
in
solution?
the long term, in the long term. There's a long way to go yet. I mean, to make a fusion plant to be economically competitive, there's a lot of engineering to be done, there's a lot of materials science to be done. The pathway we went through with nuclear fission, we've now got to go through with fusion. So it's not going to be tomorrow, it's not going to be next year, it's going to be maybe a decade or two before we have large amounts of fusion energy, but we are much closer to it now than we were, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. It is coming closer.
Now, as I understand it, the problem with fusion energy is it's just so very hot that nothing can really contain it. It has to be floating in some sort of magnetic plasma beam. I've probably described that in a really terrible way. Could you explain some of the physics there?
Using a plasma to hold the fusion, and that creates very high temperatures, higher than any metallic structure can sustain. So you've got to keep the metal away from the fusion using your magnets. And again, that's one of the biggest advances of the past few years has been the control of that process. But even then, we still have to sort out the problems of breeding the fuel. We have to sort out the problems of having sustainable, long lifetimes for structural components. And that's where the engineering is at now. That's where the serious investments are being made in developing the engineering and the materials to make the plant function at scale.
Does this technology need more investment? Is one of the reasons why we sort of have been not really advancing as fast as perhaps we'd like to in this area for the last few decades, because it frankly hasn't had that much funding?
Yeah, it is. One can always move technology forward with funding, and it's really exciting to see the investments going in the past few years, both at the small scale and the large scale in fusion. That's what's really pushing it forward. Yeah, you will not produce fusion power, fusion energy without putting substantial investment in for a long period of time. It's not going to come quickly.
Well, it is a fascinating area. And James Marrie, thank you so much for talking through some of the basics there for us. I know you've got to go off and teach a lecture and try and mould those minds who are going to create that nuclear fusion that's going to save us all in the decades to come.
People are important. The engineers and scientists are important. We need them.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and sparing some of your time this morning. We really, really appreciate it. Finally today, let's head over to the world of polling. James Crouch is Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Opinium and joins us live now. James, the polls have moved remarkably in the last 3 weeks. It's really quite stark to see where the Conservative Party is now viewed. Has any Prime Minister had quite as bad a start as this?
I don't think any Prime Minister has had quite as bad a start as this. I think when we, even last week, when we saw her poll ratings go off a cliff for the first time, that she was already at the kind of levels of Theresa May and Boris Johnson at the kind of worst stages of their premiership. And as you can see up on the screen now, while we saw a Labour Party lead of 19 points, basically a week or so ago, this weekend that went up to 21. So it's not getting any better, probably getting worse.
It's clear that there have been some issues for this government in terms of communication. They big popular announcement on energy price control came just at the time that, of course, Her Majesty the Queen passed away, and understandably it got very little media coverage. And then almost immediately, with very little time to prepare to roll the ground, we saw that fiscal statement as well. I wonder, given the very peculiar circumstances in which this government got going, is there a path as we enter what I suppose we can all hope to be more normal time going forward? Is there a path now for this Prime Minister to turn things round?
Well, I think the main challenges around that is, I think that the biggest selling points of that budget the government don't really want to own, and some of the biggest downsides to it are essential to their economic narrative. So, for example, the huge energy bailout, which obviously is very welcome, doesn't really fit in with this free market, smaller government message that Liz Truss really wants to get across. So she's not really owning the energy price cap in the way that another prime minister might have done. On the other hand, her whole economic message around lower taxes, well, once again, even though people do want to see economic growth, they're a bit more sceptical about whether low taxes are actually going to be the way to doing that. So all in all, I'm not sure there's that much in the government's approach or the essentials of the government's approach that basically gives her the ingredients to turn it around, at least in the short term.
I find it remarkable that the government hasn't got this sort of rebutting operation going over. The Labour Party for the last 2 weeks has been saying that the Tories have crashed the economy 3 weeks ago, and yet across that same time period, the Office for National Statistics have actually said that instead of contracting, the economy has grown. They've revised up those growth figures. I mean, is this simply an issue of communication here? That do people genuinely believe that the economy has nosedived off a cliff? And could, with smarter comms, this government actually explain what's really gone on?
Well, I think there's a combination between the comms element and the actual political leadership element here. So, yes, on one hand, better communication would have made this an awful lot better. But the real problem here is the political leadership and the planning. So on one hand, that whole basically releasing a mini budget without any kind of check on that as a major fiscal statement was a terrible idea anyway. But the main thing that really happened was the whole basic market reaction and market backlash. And we didn't really hear anything from number 10, from number 11 for quite a considerable period of time. So what you allowed to develop was almost this kind of vacuum of leadership where everything looked like it was going wrong, and looked like no one was at the helm. So by the time they did eventually come out and say, well, you know, we'll do whatever it takes to manage the situation, the damage had already been done. So even if we are now back in growth, and even if we are now back in growth, there's a question over whether people even understand that or realize that yet. I think the big problem is that even if this strategy of theirs works, low taxes brings about high growth, the kind of tarnishing of the Conservatives' reputation on economic competency means they are probably unlikely to see the benefit from doing so.
Really, really interesting stuff there, James Crouch. So thank you so much for talking it through. And I hope for at least our part here on GB News, we can try and explain that the pound does also go up as well as going down. Sometimes I think that other broadcasters only ever point to the down arrows. Sometimes we should point to the up arrows too. James Crouch, thank you so much for joining us here this morning. Well, that's it for the briefing today. Thank you so much for your company. I'll be back, of course, tomorrow at 9:30 as this extraordinary week of politics continues to roll on, as MPs return to those green benches and as the Prime Minister tries to surf those varying views on her backbenches. Well, until then, I'll see you tomorrow morning. Up next, it's To The Point, but before then, the weather.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking
Early rain clearing the southeast with sunny spells following scattered showers in the northwest. Let's take a look at the details. Well, a dry and locally chilly start to the day with plenty of sunshine, although a little cloud is possible at first in the east. Breezy, especially along northern coasts at first. Cloud and patchy rain will take most of the morning to fully clear, but dry and sunny conditions will follow from the north. Breezy around coastal areas with an isolated shower possible across North Wales. Otherwise, it will be dry with plenty of sunshine for all. A rather breezy day, especially towards the northwest, where the odd isolated shower is possible during the morning. Otherwise, it will be dry with plenty of prolonged sunny spells for all. It will be a dry day, but also rather breezy,